most of those photos were actually taken using IR photography, which stands for infrared photography. For those who click on this video, you know what this is going to be about. Really, this video is going to be a very niche style of photography, which is infrared photography. Let me kind of demonstrate why those photos looked a little different. I actually used this particular filter. So this is actually the Hoya R72 filter, which actually in particular blocks a lot of light out, except light that is hitting in the infrared spectrum. As you can see, if I flash this light out, it's hitting a lot of color, but if you see here, it's actually blocking a lot of light except red color light, which is infrared light from the infrared spectrum. So I want to cover two things. I want to cover what is light, specifically we'll hit on a little bit of the UV, visible light spectrum, and then infrared spectrum, and then we'll dive into specifically why does this photography exist and what is a little different. So let's actually cover a little bit about light itself. So light is really, it comes in a form of energy. That's the best way you could describe it. Particularly, light is photons coming from a light source. In this case, most of the light from the earth comes from the sun, right? And the sun gives a very wide verse of photons. And so to cover a little bit, as energy is propagated from light, a light source, you actually have different levels of wavelengths that can be hit, right? And so if you look at this chart here, on the higher end, which is on the left side over here, we're going to talk about gamma rays. So gamma rays are the very dangerous high energy levels of light, or in this case photons, that actually are emitted from the sun when you're really close to it. Gamma bursts are, well, those interesting light and colorations that you see from the sun. Now, if you dive into a little bit more further into it, you'll see a bit wider wavelength from the gamma rays. You have the X-rays, which is another form of energy that can be damaging. And then from there, you actually have the first part that we're going to talk about, which is ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light is essentially, well, UV, a little bit more dangerous spectrum of light that we see come from the sun. So this is the reason that you put on sunblock, why you wear sunshades during the day, as well as other reasons. But UV light at a high dosage still is fairly dangerous and can cause damage to you. But what's interesting is that there's different revealed portions of things that we can't see as humans that fall under the UV. That's kind of where humans fall into. So we have the visible light spectrum. The visible light spectrum, as you can see from this chart, is actually all the colors in the rainbow. So you have purple on one end, and then you have red on the other. And that specific wavelength of light is actually 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. And then after you fall in from on the right, as you go further and further out, according to this chart that I'm showing you, the red spectrum, after 700, that's kind of the limit that we can see as humans. And once you get to a little further out, you hit the IR range, which is usually about 700 up to about 1400 nanometers or so, give or take. And what's interesting about this is that, again, just like the UV spectrum, IR also reveals different sort of light features, if you will. And so to kind of dictate, there's actually a whole subset of photography that ranges from UV all the way to, let's say, IR. So in this particular filter that I actually mentioned, this is the filter that actually goes from the 720 nanometer range. So it's actually going to be blocking a lot of light besides anything that's not going to be falling into roughly the 722 nanometers light range. And what's interesting, as you can see again, when I shine the light, it's actually going to be blocking everything that's not going to be hitting that spectrum. And because infrared in most cases, the way that we see it, is actually going to be red. So a lot of things, and the reason you want that is when you actually look at cameras and their sensors, they have a specific filter on them. I believe it's called the the ultraviolet and IR filters that are on top of your sensor. And I'll show you a picture here. This filter actually cuts a lot of the UV to IR light nano range. And the reason you want that is because if you don't have that, you'll see a lot of, well, smudged colors, false colors, and you don't necessarily want that unless you're going to be doing specific creative purposes, just like IR photography or UV photography. And some people that really get into it, they get things called full spectrum cameras that, as the name implies, sees the full spectrum of light. And in most cases, because of sensitivity of light and photons and everything, you actually will see specifically the full spectrum camera used in the UV visible light as well as the IR filter range. And you could actually buy specific filters. Kolari Vision is a well-known company that actually experiments with how many different types of filters to cut different types of light. If you get into, let's say, a lot of astrophotography, deep space photography, there's other companies that actually do specific wavelengths to cut certain types of light wavelengths. So you could actually get certain elements, for example, that will only show up in space because they're vibrating at a specific frequency. I'll link a couple of videos down below to kind of describe a few of these things, but what's really interesting is when you actually start diving into nuances of what makes visible light slightly different than IR photography. Creative applications of IR photography it's interesting because it will allow you to give a surreal color of these of different photos, as well as it makes skin on humans actually look very creamy, if you will. But what's really interesting is how it actually swaps a lot of the colors that we normally would see. So in this example, in places where you would see white, blues, and naturally greens, it actually switches to, let's say, reds. It switches the greens to red, and then it swaps the blue almost to like a darker color, or in some cases it swaps natural whites into almost a yellow bright color. So depending on what filtering or light blocking that you do, you could actually get different effects. But because I don't have a full spectrum camera or necessarily the filters to go with it, the conversion process gets a little expensive. So I actually just thought I'd play around with this little filter from Hoya. But what was interesting is a lot of my colors in my images that you'll see are actually completely red. And again, it comes down to the infrared spectrum. But what's interesting is you could still play around with the color contrasting of a lot of things in it. And from what you saw in the intro, I'll show you, we'll hop on into Lightroom and capture one, and we'll see some of these photos in action. And I'll kind of compare and contrast some of these images that I would take and play with in black and white normally, and then how they look black and white from an IR image itself. So let's hop onto the computer and just kind of compare and contrast these really interesting images.
All right. So let's take a look at a couple of these images that I shot with regular coloring and then IR coloring. So let's take a look at this first shot right here. As you can see, a lot of it on its own is just not really showing any interesting highlight. But the moment you place the IR filter, you're going to get a lot of this red, orange, and yellow coloring. You can't notice a lot of the coloration just yet, but the moment I switch over to monochrome on this color, you can kind of start seeing that ghost highlighting that a lot of the foliage and natural, a lot of living entities are going to be giving. So let's actually do a little bit of adjusting here. And as you can see, the rocks don't change too much other than just being a little bit brighter and darker in other spots. But if we switch over to the color and also cast it to the black and white, you'll actually start seeing a drastic difference on its own. Let's switch over again. And here and here, you can drastically notice that you notice more detail of a light being absorbed or blocked. In this case, absorbed from the tree. With the moment you switch over to more of IR placing, you'll notice that, well, one, it's not going to be as sharp, but two is that it's definitely going to be brighter in certain spots. once you actually edit and work with the color a little bit, you could actually play around and get something like this. You actually have to do some color channel swapping to do this, but really for simplicity's sake, at least in this short mini tutorial, let's play around with how some of these actually change. And I have a couple other examples here. So water doesn't change too much. It just gets a little bit darker in some cases, or a little bit brighter. So in this case, if we switch over from this image, so here's just the color in black and white. The interesting part is this, in my opinion, is this right here. As you can see, the water actually becomes a tinge darker, in my opinion. And here is some grass that was very bright green in front of the river. When you swap over, it almost becomes just a phantom grass. It's very, very interesting how you could play around with this. There are some hindrances I should warn you, is when you're actually playing around with this particular filter, there is a lot of ghosting that could happen. And ghosting, for those who don't know, is this right here. When you hit the lens, particularly with the sun directly, you'll get some fragmenting that happens, and that's what we call ghosting. So if we actually go here, you actually notice it a lot less. So the ghosting prominently happens when it's actually hit with your normal camera. And so because those colors are being refracted from visible light, when you actually shift over to more IR lighting, it actually doesn't happen as often. So here's the same shot, but not including the color casting. As you can see, the grass and the plants almost become an ethereal bright white, if you will. And it almost looks like the IR photos are almost as if they're taking pitch blackness, which is interesting. And again, here, you unfortunately will lose a bit of the detail when you switch over from, let's say, traditional black and white to IR black and white. You unfortunately lose a little bit of detail, but that's just due to how you focus. Because this lens or this filter has a 10 stop built into it, that's the only way how you could essentially filter out a lot of the light. You unfortunately have to do a lot of focusing, so just something to be aware of. I think this particular tree is actually my favorite example. So if we switch over to black and white on its own, the tree is fairly dark on its own. But when we actually switch from over to this, you actually get a very interesting white cast that happens on this. We actually adjust these two. Look at that. The interesting part too is because it is IR, this particular photo, these two photos were actually taken in just before sunset. And as you can see from this one, you have naturally white and gray lighting up here. But when you actually shift over to the IR, it looks like it has almost a darker cast, and that's actually due to the sunset itself. And when sunset's happening, because you're getting a lot of different colors being bent from our natural exposure of the oxygen and our atmosphere, when the sun is going down, it doesn't have a full concentration of light happening. So you'll actually get light that's being quote unquote bent and turned because of the natural reflection and refraction from our atmosphere. So I would say if you are going to be playing around with IR photography, it shines best when it's pure daylight, or if you really want to get very creative and have very interesting shots, blue light, blue hour and golden hour are by far the best time of day, in my opinion, to actually get more interesting contrasty photos. So yeah, that's kind of just the basic really of how I play around with IR photography.